And now our host, Stephen Lee Morris.
Sheldon Epps is a theater leader. He ran the Pasadena Playhouse from 1997 through 2027. That's a 20-year-old tenure. He has just published an autobiography. It's called My Own Directions, A Black Man's Journey into the American Theater. It's published by McFarland Publishers in North Carolina. And Sheldon is here to discuss with us issues of race relations and its correspondence to leadership in the Southern California area and more broadly across the country. Sheldon Epps, welcome to Animal Farm.
Thank you, Stephen. Good to be with you. Good to see you again.
Likewise. We were just saying before we hit the record button that it's probably been 4 or 5 years since we've actually.
At least, I think, yeah.
Thank you, COVID. That's very helpful. But it's been 5 years since you've left the Pasadena Playhouse.
Right. Yes, I left in 2017, and
so you had a 20-year tenure running a major regional theater. You were hired in 1997 to run a major American regional theater, among the few artistic directors of color.
Yes.
The first question, I would like to jump forward now that you've been gone for a while. You've retired. You've written a book. It's an autobiography, and it's called My Own Directions, and it's published by McFarland Publishers in North Carolina.
That's right.
And it surveys your entire life coming up, your original fascination in the theater, and the long and winding road to running the Pasadena Playhouse of all places, which would be thought of one of the most wealthy white enclaves in the United States. And theater. So that was something of an anomaly. Partly it had to do with your interest in musical theater, which is a very popular American form. That was the point of connection. But as you point out in the book, and as I'm sure you'll point out here, there were many points of disconnection too. Before we get to that, I would like to be obnoxiously topical. As we're recording this, the explosion at Los Angeles City Hall has still not quelled. By the time this is posted, this may have changed, but as of the moment, only one of the 3 civic leaders who uttered horrible racist remarks or participated in them, laughed along with them if they didn't actually utter them, only one has resigned. That's Nuri Martinez. Gil Cedillo remains on the board, and Kevin DeLeon remains on the board. And here we have, it's a paradox, because you have a Latino population, which is more than 50% of the Los Angeles city, and yet their representation on the city council is only 1/3, and have essentially a caucus of them scheming, doing a zero-sum power game of how they can hang on to and expand their power at the expense of Black communities.
Right.
And you just go, whoa, this is everything that the civil rights movement sought to avoid.
Yes.
This is the behavior, the very behavior that was the embodiment of white supremacy. And if you don't change the behavior, all you're doing is changing the characters, not the society. That's forgive me, that's just my screed. I would like to know, as a Black man who was in a prominent position of leadership, how this strikes you. Are you furious, like so many people of all ethnicities? Are you going, hey, this is America, this is just happening across the country, this is a good thing, this is a bad thing? I'm just really curious what you're feeling.
Well, on the simplest level, it is a terrible thing. It is odious, it's disgusting, it's flabbergasting in some ways. honestly, I'm too tired of the repetition of these kinds of events to be furious.
Yes,
Fury
yes.
takes a great deal of energy, and having watched things like this for my whole life and read about them for periods long before I was on this earth. I'm spent of fury. I have righteous anger and indignation, but I'm too tired to be furious about it. But I think you've said something very important, which is either grabbing or holding on to power is at the very root of white supremacy.
Yes.
You know, the
Yes.
fear that we are going to lose our power, and become the minority, not only numerically, but be treated as the minority. The fear of that is at the root of this kind of behavior in our city and nationally and perhaps universally. That power retention, I think, is so much at the root of racism and white supremacy. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just another indication of the lengths to which people will go to retain and or get power. I think that's what's so evident in this current election cycle, and certainly will be in the next presidential election.
So
What do we do
if
to
we
keep
have a group of people of color who are behaving as appallingly as the whites did, then what is the point? How exactly have we advanced? That's the
Yes,
rhetorical question.
yes, it is. But to be blunt, those are very fair-skinned Latino people.
Okay.
And that sounds simplistic, but I think it has something to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we keep power? How do we not give the power to the darker Latinos and the black and brown dark people?
Those are the dangerous ones.
Those are the dangerous ones. We're okay. We passed the paper bag test, which has existed for hundreds of years. So we're okay. We're not quite white, but we're not brown or black.
Oh man.
So I know it's almost farcical and therefore tragic at the same time.
It is. I just have to wonder if this question of bigotry is just hardwired into it. And I know that's not a particularly popular point of view because we're supposed to be enlightened and supposed to learn and be able to overcome these primal instincts. But as I think I mentioned earlier, for instance, let's remove whites and white colonialism and black people and Latinos from the entire equation, and let's go back to California history. And you have the Tongva tribe, which presided over the richest, most fertile valleys of Southern California.
Yeah.
You had the Chumash in the mountains. And now the Tongva had access to, they could grow all the crops. They had access to the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. They went out and fished. So they had tons of stuff and wealth to trade with, to barter with. And the Chumash had, a bunch of acorns. That's about what grew in the mountains and only at the lower elevations, and maybe some pine trees if they were higher up. And the Tongva forbade their tribe from marrying with the Chumash. I mean, it was miscegenation in their terms. And you just wonder how much of this is just hardwired into human nature, or even into animal nature, when you see when you see barnyard poultry picking on birds of a color flock together.
No, I think it is hardwired in our somewhere in our internal systems. Comfort with like beings, comfort with those who are like us, and discomfort with those who are not like us.
Yeah.
I so often have felt in my history, not as much anymore, but certainly at a time, discomfort of walking into a room full of only white people or being the only Black person in a classroom.
Yes.
And I've seen white people literally be physically uncomfortable in a room full of Black people. So I think there is something systemic to it. And I also think that you're right, there's something economic to it. you know.
But your issue of power.
Who have all the stuff have the power.
Who gets the food? Who gets the food?
Yeah, who gets the good food? Now, you forget the ingenuity of the people who managed to survive on all the leftovers. Now, that was the brilliance.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, but you took all the good stuff of the cow, and I took all the stuff you wanted to throw away and turned it into a fabulous cuisine.
Yes.
You know, but you sort of forget that kind of brilliance because they got the expensive stuff.
This is
My father, you'll love this. My father used to say, my father was very poor, grew up in a family of 8 kids. And he used to say, I didn't know the cow had anything except gravy until I was 20.
Yeah. Those are some very wet cows in those fields. You just poke them and they go to puddles. Yeah.
They pour out gravy. Good gravy.
That's very funny. Let's go back to 1997. At the moment you were hired at the Pasadena Playhouse, it was sort of, the way you describe it, it was somewhat an idiosyncratic set of circumstances that led to
it was.
You were obviously, you had made your mark in the American theater. Otherwise you just wouldn't have been appointed. At the same time, and this is in your book, there was some considerable resistance just because you were a Black man. Wondering if you can address that process, what you went through, and did it ever resolve once, say after 5 years, since you were there for 20? Did it take time?
Yes, it was complicated all along the way from the time I got there through the 20 years. Became less complicated and perhaps less challenging, but it never went away, I think. I got the position because I'd worked at the theater as a freelance director several times, successfully, obviously. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been invited.
Sure.
I was kind of snuck in there by the leadership of the theater, the staff leadership of the theater at the time, without much involvement from the board of directors or anybody.
Well, this would be the executive director at the time.
The executive director, yes, whose name was Lars Hansen.
Yes.
And he was running the theater by himself at the time, and he realized he needed and wanted help from an artistic entity. So because I worked at the theater several times and we had a good relationship, he kind of said, well, let's just make this happen.
My memory was at that time that the theater was in trouble.
It was in trouble. It did not have a very good artistic reputation.
Right.
Sales were not good. Certainly contributed income was very, very low. Nothing from foundations or corporations or even government support at all. So yeah, it was in trouble. But still, it had this beautiful physical facility, and it was in what I believe is a hotbed of theatrical talent in the LA community.
For those of you not from the Los Angeles area, the Pasadena Playhouse is the State Theater of Los Angeles. It's a magnificent work of architecture.
Yes, yes.
Built in what, the 1920s?
1925, the theater was built. So yeah, I was kind of snuck in there, and I think there were many, when the announcement was made, there were a lot of people kind of going, well, how did that happen? You know, how did this Black guy get into this?
Well, the board had to approve you, correct? Or did they not?
It was almost that they didn't disapprove me.
Well, that must have made you just be overflowing with.
Yeah, and I also have to say at the time it was not a very strong and not a highly functioning board. It existed, but sort of because it had to exist. It was a not-for-profit organization, so they had to have a board, but they weren't highly functioning. I will say that at the time. So yes, there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of questions about, you know, how did you get into our theater, and what are you going to do? A lot of people, there were rumors that I was going to try to turn it into Negro Ensemble Company West and only do Black plays over and over again, and while it was certainly my intention to have more diversity, it wasn't to turn it into a Black theater, whatever that means. But there was fear about that. There was fear. And of course, when I started programming plays by Black writers and putting artists of color on stage, that fear only grew. But you can't argue with success, as many of those productions became the highest selling shows in the theater's history.
I'd like to jump, if I may just jump in on it, because it's a very important entry point, what you're just saying right there about that success. I'm assuming success meant that you attracted crowds that hadn't existed before.
Yes, box office success.
And was this a new audience? Was this a new Black audiences, or was it an expansion of the white audience, or both?
Both.
Mm-hmm.
I frequently tell the story that I would sit, Pasadena Playhouse is a beautiful courtyard, which kind of functions as the lobby of the theater.
Right.
Because of our wonderful California weather. So everybody gathers in the courtyard before you go into the theater proper. And I would frequently sit in that courtyard and be the only person of any color, and the only person under 60 at the time, both of which I thought were extremely dangerous for the health of the theater. So yes, I wanted to attract audiences of color, specifically the Black audience, but also the Latino audience, doing plays like Anna in the Tropics.
Yeah.
So the increase in box office was literally audience development and attracting new audiences from Pasadena, but also from the greater Los Angeles area.
Mm-hmm. It's not that far away, Los Angeles.
Yeah.
From Los Angeles, it's like, what, 10 minutes?
It's less far away than parts of real Los Angeles are from downtown.
Yeah, yeah.
We can get down from Pasadena to downtown in 20 minutes. It'll take you from Santa Monica, which is part of LA, an hour.
It can take an hour and a half, depending on when. Yeah.
Exactly. But the attracting younger audiences was as important to me as audiences of color. People forget that not only was the first play I did not a Black play, it was a very white play. It was The Real Thing by Tom Stoppard, which I did because it's a brilliant play, but because it's about young people. It's about young people fighting their way through relationships, trying to find the real thing. What does that mean? How do I get it? And so that production was enormously successful because it attracted a younger audience, which the theater had not had in a long time.
Interesting. Very interesting. And then you said the fear level went down. Was it just because you can't argue with success, or was it a clear? This is somewhat of a reductive, sort of a reductive rendition that the Playhouse just had this slow curve up. My memory as a critic at the time is that it wobbled and it had surges of real success, and then it slipped, and then I'm just
which I think is typical about every theater.
Yeah, absolutely. It wouldn't. If everyone says, "Oh yes, it was a clear trajectory upward," I wouldn't.
No, it was not. It was not. No, it definitely highs and lows throughout the 20 years. Yes, the success calmed people down, but it was also the elucidation of my taste as an artistic director, which, yes, did include plays by writers and artists of color, but also included Tom Stoppard and Noel Coward and Kaufman and Hart, and a full wide range of theatrical experiences. So everybody said, "Oh, well, okay." Number one, I do like some of these plays by the Black writers, but even if I don't like them, I'm not going to have to see them every time I go to the theater. So
Yeah.
I'll calm down a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
But a lot of it was the discovery that Steve and I sometimes say that before I got there, the theater was doing the same play over and over again, and I don't mean that literally.
No, I know exactly what you. I know exactly.
They were doing a 4 to 7 character play with one set with a group of people who thought they were funny. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. But
Even in the year
play that was being seen. So
even in the year 1995, it was those plays carried the aesthetic of 1949.
Yes,
It's not going to attract young audience.
Yes. So people they liked this new diet that they were being fed. You know, this higher quality of writing primarily. You know, more interesting writing, more interesting stories, more interesting characters on the stage.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And now that we've seen, I'm going to return to the original thing. Now we've seen this blow up at City Hall and all that reveals, and a lot of people saying, "Oh, thank goodness, the stone has been unturned. Now we know. At least we know who those people are. Those people. It's not you can't make a generalized statement, but we know." Power, you know, the thing, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely, that seems to be really the clearest indication, and it's in international news when the president of the United States weighs in on what's happening at the LA City Council. You know it's serious. When the Guardian and Der Spiegel are reporting on it from London and Berlin, that you know, this is a moment. This is a cultural moment. This is news. It seems to me that you have felt that certain groups have been excluded systemically, to use that awful hackneyed term.
Right.
And that you wanted to remedy that. And the remedy is to keep the door open to everybody, as you say. It includes, Susan Laurie Park said it includes Tom Stoppard. There has been a movement. It's not, beg your pardon?
And it includes Nilo Cruz.
Nilo Cruz. Right. And there, nationally, there has been a movement that says it's these old white guys who are running theater, but I actually think when you hear them talk more, they're actually not talking about old white guys. They're just talking about old guys.
Yeah.
They say the old guys need to get out of the way and a new generation needs to take, because they carry the old mechanisms, the old aesthetics, the old strictures of the theater with them, and the theater cannot advance. Their time, they've had their time. Let's get them out and let's have a whole new generation of often inexperienced people. And the counter argument is, well, when the old generation came in, they were inexperienced too.
Yeah, well, and many of them founding their theaters, many of them
exactly
building and founding their theaters.
And this is the nature of institutional change, and societal change. When people say, come on, get out of the way, you're done, you've been doing the same thing for 30 years, move on, give somebody else a chance. That doesn't sound unreasonable on the face of it. Do you agree? To what degree do you agree with that, and to what degree do you diverge from that?
I very much agree with it. I decided that it was time to give someone else a chance, and that motivated my leaving my position at the theater. I was tired of the work. I loved the work. I loved being an artistic director. I love running a theater. But I thought 20 years was enough. Frankly, I thought 15 was enough. You know, that's about the point at which a rotation should happen.
Yes.
And I did not want to be one of those men or women who stayed too long at the fair and got to a point where everybody was whispering in the hallways, you know, it's really time for them to leave. but nobody would say that out loud. You know, I thought it was important for me to open the space to someone else. And I think it's important for people of my generation to do that. And I've said that to some of those people who've been in their positions for 30 or 35 years. I've said, I think it's time for you to go. You're still brilliant, but you know, you need to give this kitchen to somebody else and let them cook in it now.
Yeah. That makes sense.
You know, we were talking before about fear of losing power, and in some cases, that's true in arts organizations as well. You know, people who've been founding theaters or been at their theaters for so long, they think, well, yes, it is time for me to go, but if I go, what am I going to do? You know, I'll have no power. I can't give myself a job. So what am I going to do? You know, and frankly, I face that as well. Now, fortunately, I've been very busy since I left, but you don't know at the time. You don't know if the phone is going to ring, or that, you know, you can call anybody and have them take your call, or anybody will call you. So I think fear is at the heart of that as well.
Looking at the national scene and even the international scene, if you pay attention to that, and I assume you do. When you left, despite all your successes, and they were abundant and they were remarkable, you pulled a theater out from the mud. Well, and I'm talking about financially and in some way culturally. And yet, the theater was, by the time you left, for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with your leadership, it was still facing financial challenges. And the question is, does this model of regional theaters, can it work? Can it do its function? Can it spread art to communities in a way that's viable, or does something fundamental need to be changed in order that this genre can sustain without becoming a dinosaur?
It's a very good, hard question that we've all been asking for years, not only the years that I was at Pasadena Playhouse, but before. And my answer is, I'm not sure that it can or does work. Those places, and I guess I'm talking about countries primarily, that have really healthy arts scenes, have those really healthy arts scenes because of government subsidy, because the country makes the cultivation and the sustaining of art a priority in their national budget, in the way that this country makes the military a priority. If we got a small percentage for the arts of what is spent on the defense and military budget in this country, if we got a small chunk of that, not even a big chunk, but a small chunk of that went to the National Endowment for the Arts, the day-to-day fight would not be nearly so difficult. But instead, we get chipped away a little bit as everything else gets more expensive. So I'm not sure that this not-for-profit model can work unless that changes. And I think we're seeing that right now. Theaters came out of the pandemic, arts organizations, perhaps all arts organizations, but I know about theaters, kind of healthy, because they all got those loans.
Yeah.
And they were producing.
Yeah, that was essentially government funding. Yeah.
Yeah, that was government funding. Now everybody's panicked because that money has been spent sustaining the operation during that time. You're not getting that money anymore, and you have to go back to producing now and having the money flow out.
I think we can conclude with certainty that a pandemic is the answer. Only a pandemic can save you.
Right. If we could manage to do that every 5 years, we'd be fine.
We'll be absolutely fine. No, we are a commercial culture. I mean, that's big secret. I know it's a huge revelation, but the theater reflects the culture that we have. And when different countries have different priorities and they fund those priorities, and we see that in different countries, and we don't see that very much in the United States. It's not an exclusive argument. There is government funding, but it's pretty paltry compared to
It is paltry.
countries, even in certainly in Europe and in South America, where government funding, the ratio of government funding is much higher, because that kind of civic discourse is considered important for the health of the country.
Yeah, I once heard that there is, I want to say Hamburg, but maybe it's somewhere else, but there's an opera house in Germany that gets more government funding than the total of the National Endowment of the Arts.
Yeah.
That's shocking. But that's the very clear elucidation of where that country's priorities are, and what they're going to literally take care of, and what we in this country don't take care of. You're on your own, figure it out. We'll give you a little bit of money. You have to figure the rest out. Yeah. Well, it can't be figured out.
Yeah, well, the Elizabethan playwrights were subsidized by the Queen.
Yes, exactly.
And that's really been, and of course, the conundrum of that is that in Shakespeare's plays, England never loses the war. So you could argue that the funding has a direct patronage has its consequences. It has an effect on content, but that's too narrow a line. My Own Directions is a new book, an autobiography written by Sheldon Epps, subtitled A Black Man's Journey in the American Theater. And Sheldon Epps, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen. Pleasure to talk to you. Thanks.
If you enjoy Animal Farm, please support us on Patreon.